It was a World Cup, certainly, of outstanding players.
With teams being more athletic and fitter.
Way quicker on the ball.
More confident and efficient.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you tuning in from around the world. My name is Sarai Bareman. I am the Chief Officer for Women's Football in FIFA, and it is my pleasure to host you all today in the online panel discussion for the FIFA Women's World Cup 2019 Physical Development of the Women's Game. We have a really exciting lineup of panelists today, but before I introduce them, just a couple of housekeeping matters. For those of you that are tuning in live, we do have a great lineup here, so you will have an opportunity to ask questions. You can do that either via email. The email address is onlinepanel@fifa.org, or you can head over to our Twitter account @FIFAWWC. Send in your questions. We've got a great lineup, and I will do my best to filter through those questions and feed them through to our panel. So, the FIFA Women's World Cup 2019 was by far the most successful edition of the tournament across so many different areas. The broadcast viewership, the digital reach, fans in the stadiums, media outlets covering the tournament, and the number of territories across the globe that showed our game live. The event is by far the biggest opportunity every 4 years to showcase our game and to shine a spotlight on the work undertaken by FIFA towards its women's football strategy. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of this work is the understanding and development of the physical aspects of our game. Yes, the tournament in France this year was undoubtedly huge and successful, but without the players performing at the highest level throughout the tournament, we would have a completely different outcome. As fans, broadcasters, commercial sponsors, TV viewers experience the game at the highest level, like we saw on the fields in France last year, it's important to understand that there is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to get those athletes performing at their highest level. FIFA has taken the responsibility to analyze the demands on those players in order to support the practitioners, the coaches, the trainers, and the performance experts to help the players to reach their full potential. That is why the physical analysis, which we launched this week, is so important. We need to understand to a deeper level the physical demands on our players, and this will allow us to support them in shining their brightest on the world stage. To dig deeper into this, I'm very, very excited about the 4 panelists that we have joining us today. So I'm going to introduce them to you now. First of all, we have Dawn Scott, who is one of the authors of our report. Dawn has worked extensively in the high performance area of women's football, both in England and in the USA. She was part of the support staff of the winning US team at the World Cup in 2015 and last year in 2019, as well as the 2012 Olympics. She is now working with the English national team as a senior women's physical performance manager. Welcome, Dawn. Paul Bradley is the other author of our report. He's a sports scientist who has published over 60 peer-reviewed articles on the science of football. He is currently an associate editor for the journal Science and Medicine in Football, and an advisory board member for the Journal of Sports Sciences. In addition, he works as a reader in sports performance at the Liverpool John Moores University, leads the football portfolio, and is a consultant for FC Barcelona. Welcome, Paul. Pia Sundhage has represented Sweden in the World Cups 1991 and 1995 as a player. and worked as a coach of the US team in the World Cups 2011, as well as the Olympics in 2008 and 2012. As a coach of the Swedish national team in the Olympics 2016, and she has recently started her work as a coach of the Brazilian women's national team. And last but not least, April Heinrichs was the captain of the US women's national team that won the first ever Women's World Cup in 1991. She became the head coach of the US women's national team in 2000 and 2004 Olympics and the 2003 FIFA Women's World Cup. She now supports FIFA as a technical expert, and she was the head of the technical study group for France 2019 last year. Welcome, April. So let's get into some questions. I'm going to start with you, Pia. Back in Milan, we hosted the first ever technical conference for the Women's World Cup, and you closed that conference for us. We're here again today on the occasion of the publication of the physical analysis to continue the discussion on the growth of the women's game. Why is it important that we continue analysing the trends that we see in the women's game?
You want to improve the game as a coach, and you do it over and over again, and you do it as a, from my point of view, what's good and what's bad. And today you have specialists. We have different kinds of views, which is very important. And this report is a good example of that. You know, when I read it, I get inspired. I take the data to my country, Brazil, and then I was thinking, where do we stand if you look at compared to all the figures? And I would talk to experts, sports science, respect my culture, and make sure that our strengths and weaknesses, and how could we use this data and compare, and also be humble enough to listen and learn from the best team in the US. Not only that, when I read the report 2015, there are differences between the data 2015 and 2019. What will I think will be, what kind of data will be 2023? That is my job, to make sure my experts around me, to make sure that we try to improve the game as much as possible. So it's very, very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pia. Dawn, first of all, massive congratulations for your win last year. That must have been an incredible moment for you and the team in France.
Thank you.
You were analysing the physical data in 2019 as well as in 2015. How would you describe the 2019 report and its evolution from 2015?
Yeah, I mean, in 2015, it was obviously the first time where we'd done a specific kind of physical analysis of the World Cup. So I guess in a sense, there was no template, there was no kind of comparative data to dig into from that report. So I think now having two full sets of data means you can do some comparative analysis, like Pia just highlighted there, but also obviously as you highlighted in the introduction, you know, Paul's expertise as an academic, and you know, he's a specialist in the whole kind of match analysis, physical demands of match play. So I think me and him working together, my angle being from the practitioner piece, and Paul very much from a very respected researcher, meant we could blend together what information we thought would be valuable and useful. And I think that allowed us to do a much deeper kind of analysis into the data, both from a team level, positional level, both looking at within each tournament, but then between, and then also just really looking at some contextual factors. So again, whether that was tactics, formation of teams, looking at number of days between games, looking at some kind of shape in and out of possession, and how did that correlate to some of the data and kind of movement. So I think it just allowed a much deeper analysis of the data to get a better picture of what's going on, because obviously it's not just physical. You've got to look at it in the context of the game and the tactical kind of setup of coaches as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Context is key. And I'm looking forward, as Pia said, to 2023. We'll have a third set of data, which will allow us to measure even more the evolution of the game. April, you were the head of the technical study group in France last year, where we could see a great performance technically and tactically from individuals, but also from teams. What did you see from a physical performance perspective?
First mistake, unmute yourself. Yeah, so we knew going into the World Cup that this would be a really fast, athletic, technical, tactical, maybe the highest level we've ever seen. Once the tournament started in France and the speed of execution, the speed of decision making, the speed of athleticism, and the energy from the stands and the fans was unbelievable. So we really observed an execution and a speed that we've never seen before in the women's game. It's like during the World Cup, the players elevated even more. In large part because I think we're identifying better athletes and we're training athletes and training professionals better at the club level. But some of the moments, the transition moments from the second the ball was turned over, the speed of execution to play forward, get behind the ball, and max sprints behind the ball was game-changing moments. The moment the ball was turned over and maybe they lost possession, the speed of recovery was incredible. And looking at the report that Dawn and Paul produced, looking at the distances and the moments and efforts and having, 15 to 30% increases from 2015 was incredible. Not surprising, having been there and watched the games, but it's a tribute to what the coaches and the players did in terms of their preparation before the World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% agree with you there. And you've just described, as you were describing there, I was picturing myself actually in France watching some of those matches and seeing it unfold. It really is incredible. The way that the athletes are performing to such a high level in a consistent way across the tournament is so amazing. Paul, one of the things that I've discovered, particularly since I've come into this role at FIFA, is that there is a real lack of research in the women's game, or in women's sports in general, to be honest. How can documents such as the Women's World Cup physical analysis help to create momentum for more research in the women's game, and why is it important?
I think I'm probably a little bit biased on this one, given my kind of passion for research and development, really. But personally, I think research is kind of absolutely critical to the kind of future development of most sports, including the sport we're going to be talking about today, women's football, and more so for women's football, given the lack of research in the area, really. And although football is not necessarily a science per se, I think scientific principles, applying them to football is really how, in some ways, research impacts the game. For instance, the research myself and Dawn have produced on understanding the women's game from a kind of match demands point of view. We've produced a report in detail we haven't seen before, and I think in turn that allows coaches and practitioners to optimize practices behind the scenes to enable the future of football and women's football to prepare for these types of evolutions. And the adoption of kind of scientific principles within the women's game, I think, has already started to, in some ways, change and revolutionize the game, particularly in the forms of monitoring. We know that most teams have kind of GPS monitoring, which is being developed and kind of honed via research. We see most teams now following a very systematic type of training process, which again is being honed and developed via research. And also nutrition and supplementation that powers performance on the field, that's being developed via dietetics and nutrition. So we can kind of see that research is an important part of the game now. And it's probably in some ways led to some of the kind of performance evolution that myself and Dawn have detailed within this report. And personally, I do think it's going to be kind of like fascinating to see how the women's game is going to change in the future. At this moment in time, they're full of pace and power. They're explosive. They're technically and tactically very proficient and talented. Just imagine what 2030 and 2040 is going to look like. And I think this progress will kind of continue to gain even more momentum, as you mentioned, if kind of research and development is an important part of that. And I think this is especially true of the women's game, given the lack of coverage in the research literature, from the kind of science and medicine side of things, kind of right through to the kind of psychosocial side. And I think the report myself and Dawn have produced is a really nice start, because a kind of comprehensive evaluation of the physical demands of the women's game is needed, but most research questions will start from that. If we want to optimize performance, we need to know what the current demands are. If we want to optimize nutrition and supplementation, we need to know what the demands are. So it's a really good start for us to move kind of onwards and upwards in regards to research.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you there, Paul. It's something that we certainly will be prioritising in FIFA as part of our ongoing strategy for women's football. I want to stay with you, and I'm going to also introduce Dawn for this next question, because you two were the authors of our physical analysis. So how have you seen the demands of the women's game grow in this area?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of kind of the comparison from 15 to 19, obviously we had those increases in some of the higher speed metrics that teams were completing. I think what we actually did see is that some of the lower ranked teams had greater increases than some of the higher ranked teams. So for me, that kind of reflects, I think April kind of touched on it a little bit, some of the increase in fitness levels of teams globally. So not just your higher ranked teams, which I think is testament to the support and resources some of those nations now get. I would say with some of the higher ranked teams and teams who kind of progress to the latter stages of the tournament, some of the outputs seem to be more kind of correlated and contextualized to systems of play, and then even in-game management in terms of shift and system kind of in a game to protect a lead, to score a goal and so on. So I think that's just one thing for me where we need to be careful that like physical outputs are increasing, but keep it contextual in that any kind of output has to be also obviously linked into the game plan. And I think as well, just looking at kind of the increases across the board for teams from 15 to 19. Again, you look at now increased opportunities for female players to be professional players. And now they don't all have to combine a full-time career job with training on top of it. So again, just the increased professionalism of the game, I think now is leading to better prepared players. I think additional to that is the support around players in teams, that teams are now better resourced in terms of medical, sports science, psychology, high performance provision. So what you're now seeing is that players are now training, competing on a day-to-day basis in high performance environments, and they get a very cohesive support. And again, that support system kind of network sits around, you know, coaches like Pia, April, kind of other coaches to then inform them of kind of what their field sees and how that can translate into the performance of the players as well.
Yeah, so I'd probably just kind of echo what Dawn said there. I think the kind of first thing that stood out to me was the kind of sheer magnitude of the change in demands from kind of 2015 to 2019, especially given there wasn't a great deal of difference between 2011 and 2015. And as April mentioned, we shouldn't really be too surprised. There was a real kind of common held belief within the media and within the game itself that the game had evolved physically, and it just lacked a bit of evidence. Intuitively, when I'd watched the game, I could see it with my eyes. I could see exactly what was happening, but that's fairly subjective. And I think the really cool thing about science is it kind of confirms tangibly and in a very quantitative way. It confirms that observation. But probably more importantly, it gives us a percentage, it gives us a magnitude of that change. So when myself and Dawn looked at the intense running distance, and we could clearly see across positions, it increased by approximately 15 to 30% from 2015 to 2019. That's massive. It's absolutely huge when we look at it. And to put that into perspective, I did a bit of research on the evolution of the Premier League, and we looked at the Premier League over 7 years, and we found near enough identical percentage changes over 7 years, and the women's game did that in just 4 years. So it could possibly indicate a slightly more rapid evolution from a physical perspective when we look at the women's game. And I'd probably say that the second kind of thing that stood out for me was a little bit what Dawn said there about, you know, context is kind of king really when we're trying to interpret the physical demands. For instance, we kind of see the same player over 2 separate games have vastly different physical demands. And that was based on opposition standard and scoreline and tactics, etc. And we included a kind of separate section on that within the report. And I think for me, the most striking example was the fullback example, where in the first game, the fullbacks team was very offensive, and she would, on a regular basis, run down that channel, dribbling the ball, overlapping, crossing in advanced areas. But as soon as there was a kind of turnover in possession, she'd be producing recovery runs, she'd be pressing aggressively. And that type of dual role of a fullback bumps up the physical stats. While in the second game, her team played against a team that was very tactically astute, and she had to tuck in and be a lot more defensive in that second game, and that lowered her physical stats. And when myself and Dawn looked at the sprinting distance, the zone 5 distance, it was about 100% higher in that first game. So it really does emphasize how important context is when we're looking at physical stats. And we look at the game a bit more holistically by linking it with the tactical stuff, and it provides much more of a narrative. So context, it's really important.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, Paul, what you said. And I have to encourage all of you that have just listened into what Paul said. This report is available on FIFA.com. There is a link to the report, and it is fascinating the level of detail we go to on individual players, positions, different game contexts. The type of data that is in this report is just fascinating. Pia, I'm going to go to you because you have a very unique perspective as a coach who has worked across many different regions. Where do you see the biggest differences on the preparation of players at international level?
Well, it's so important for me to bring out the best performance in the staff. And the fitness coach, in Brazil, we have 2 fitness coaches to help us to understand what we need in order to play our very best, to be able to play our very best. So as Paul was saying, that you want to optimize, you want to do the really good thing with the left back or right back or whatever. And I think this knowledge, if you dig in this report, you could get carried away. And I think that could be dangerous. However, if you have good experts around you, sports science, and people that understand and try to explain, then it linked in with the tactical stuff. Because we can't do everything. I think a good coach make the right priorities. What do we need? And football is a running game, that's for sure. So you need to accelerate and deceleration and so on, and make sure you get the tactical stuff out there. So if you look at the staff members, for instance, compare 91, I don't think we had that many staff members when I was playing. And look at US, they are experts, and they bring so many things to the table. They offer things to the table, which is important. And this is just inspiring, regardless if you're the best team in the world or if you're the worst team in the world, I think.
Thanks, Pia. April, Pia mentioned 91 there. And as we know, you were one of the players in that championship team of that first ever edition of the Women's World Cup. What differences have you experienced from when you first started in the women's game to what you see and experience today?
Yeah, so many differences. Even the video is colored now. Back then, I think it was black and white. Yeah, I mean, when I look at the World Cup now, Pia and I played against each other in that World Cup. So it's really a great feeling to have that question be asked. We see the female players today are incredibly athletic in every position. They're in the top fitness of their careers, of their professional careers. As Don and Paul wrote about, and even Pia just mentioned it, sort of the evolution of the professionalism of the game. We had no positional experts, no sports scientists. I don't recall even a hydration talk about the importance of hydration until 1996 before the Olympic Games. So we didn't know about hydration back then. So now we're seeing in the 2019 Women's World Cup, we saw these women at the top of their professional careers. We see them being able to press for long periods of time, from game to game. They're smarter than we were back in the 91 World Cup in terms of their pressing. They pick and choose when to press. We see them going over 7 games now. Back in 91, the games were only 80 minutes. So the differences are huge. For me personally, the biggest differences that I've witnessed, and I really appreciate Paul mentioning evidence-based, this is my opinion, goalkeeping and the center mids. So we saw the workload of flank players, and we kind of know that from the game. But today's goalkeepers are far more athletic. They move their feet to get their hands to the ball. They are tall, but they're athletic now. The Chilean goalkeeper, the Final Four goalkeepers, the German goalkeeper, the number of goalkeepers that were outstanding in this World Cup. It was the best. We were talking about it from the start, and we talked about it at the finish, and they were game changers. And the center midfielders. Used to be teams hid their slowest player, but their smartest player centrally. And right there, she just kind of made things happen. But now we're seeing center midfielders like Henri from France that can pop up anywhere on the field. We're seeing 6 foot tall center midfielders who don't move like previously 6 foot tall people. So the midfielders are more athletic, agile. Their box to box, their ability box to box, their influence on both ends of the field are incredible. And then I have to mention also that we've talked about, the improvement of the game. And this is, I know, one of FIFA's goals. And the improvement with CONMEBOL, Asia, and CAF in terms of their workloads was incredible. Again, somewhere between 14 and 20% increase from those confederations and the teams representing those confederations. So if we talk about closing the gap, there's perfect evidence in this report of countries and confederations closing the gap. It's a great return on investment. If you invest your resources, as Dawn said, as Pia alluded to, in women's soccer, women's football, if you invest your resources, your return on investment will be huge.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned about the goalkeepers, April. I have a little snapshot of some of the highlights of the report. And I was fascinated to see actually that the average total distance covered by goalkeepers during the World Cup is more than 5 kilometers, yeah, which is incredible when people consider that it's a relatively static position in the field. I want to dig a little bit deeper into the report now. And before I do that, I just want to send a reminder out to those of you that are watching us live or via YouTube. You can send in questions for our panelists. You can do that via our Twitter @FIFAWWC or via email to onlinepanel@fifa.org. So Paul, let's go deeper in the report. I want to start with you. We've heard a lot of mention about the speed zones so far. For this report, report, the speed zones have been adapted to the women's game for the first time. Can you explain a little bit more to our audience about the thresholds and why it's important that they were adapted for the women's game?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think it's a really good idea. We've got people tuning in from kind of around the world, really, with different backgrounds. So a little bit of background information would be great, I think, to kind of quantify and measure the physical demands of the women's game, really. We tend to use different types of technologies, GPS, for example, and as we used in this report, a kind of camera tracking-based technology. And to allow us to make a bit more sense of the players' activities as they move around on the field of play, we in some ways arrange the data and separate the data based on the speeds of the activities. So we have low intensity speed zones where we tend to capture activities like walking and jogging. But more importantly, we have high speed and high intensity speed zones that we're able to capture things like sprinting in. And that's really important, the higher intensity ones, because the higher intensities, that's when the critical moments occur in the game, and we want to capture that in great detail. And that's how we basically break the data up. To give you a bit of context of how it's previously been done, previous research really has kind of used a one-size-fits-all approach and used speed thresholds actually designed for men for the women's game. And as you can imagine, that kind of creates all sorts of issues, really, because when you work with different football populations, whether it be youth players or female players or male players, they're all very unique in terms of their physical characteristics, really. And you need to choose thresholds that are unique to that population and reflect their physical capabilities. So in the men's game, we have fairly established thresholds, and we've had fairly established thresholds for some time now. But this hasn't been the case for the women's game. So I think me and Dawn feel that the new thresholds produced here in the report could be the very start, really, of starting to standardise the thresholds across the board for elite senior women, really. And I think the advantage of that is that practitioners around the world and researchers start to publish data on the women's game using the same thresholds. And what that allows us to do is to actually compare between studies and create a critical mass and an evidence base that allows us to move forward and make informed decisions about what's happening from a kind of performance point of view, but also informs us on things like injury risk mitigation as well, and a whole range of different things. So yes, I think the assignment of the thresholds in this report could be the start of kind of finally setting in stone the thresholds that we're hopefully going to keep for future tournaments. And I think that's a real step forward, in my opinion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there, Paul. I think it's important that we look at women's football individually. It needs a tailor-made approach, and what's been in place for men's football, although in many cases it does help us, it's important that we dig a lot deeper and look where it is appropriate to have a separate approach for women's football, then we should take it, absolutely. Dawn, we saw an increase of 12% in distance and 8% in the efforts at zone 5. So zone 5 is our highest speed threshold. That's over 23 kilometers per hour, so like a full sprint, for the teams that reached the knockout stage. What helps teams to repeat and increase such capacities throughout an entire tournament?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot goes into it. Obviously, Paul alluded to the kind of like scientific the application of science to the preparation of players, and I think, you know, having been involved, obviously Pia and I were with the US team in 2011 and 2012, and you know, kind of since then, just how more the science has moved on and evolved, and the application of that from now, you know, using GPS systems, finding out what match demands are, then trying to replicate those match demands in training. So I think kind of that's one element of it, and then, you know, I think it's everything else that goes around it. You know, our role as a practitioner, whether it's the sports scientist, the medical team, is basically to maximize player availability for the coaches so that at any one moment in time, they've got they can choose whichever team they want for every single game. So, you know, there's so much goes into it. One is fitness levels at the start of a tournament. So that's kind of first and foremost. What are those, the physical capability of players going into a tournament? The other piece is, what is your periodization or your plan for your team going into the tournament? Then what is that training? What is that plan in the tournament? And then what is the plan for individual players? So again, what is your game management for players? Do you have the luxury of that, depending on kind of, you know, what your squad is, what availability, what injuries of players? And then it's that everything else off the pitch. So, you know, nutrition, recovery. You know, in the World Cup, there was myself and another sports scientist, and between us two and the chef, I think we made over 2,000 recovery shakes for players. So it's kind of being obsessed and being, just obsessed with that every single day in terms of preparing your players to get on the pitch. But then as soon as a match finishes, what is your recovery process to get them ready and recovered for the next match? So everything from your recovery strategies, your nutrition, your hydration, your sleep, and then basically getting them prepared and ready for the next game and to go again. And like I say, just that individual approach with each player, because every player is different. Every player can tolerate different physical loads. Every player can tolerate different match loads. Different positions have different loads in the match, like we see in the report. So again, you know, for me, you kind of look at it and typically it's your forward players who get substituted out, either to save them for next game or to actually have an impact in those positions. So again, looking at what are those training loads for players in between matches is important to then keep them ready and fresh for later in the tournament.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating the amount of work that actually goes on in the background towards these players, so that we do see them performing at their absolute peak during the matches. April, our top 4 teams in the tournament, the semi-finalists, they completed very high physical loads across the whole tournament. How can the other national teams do the same? What is needed to improve the game across all countries?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that's where I think this report can really help. This report can be a benchmark for all the professionals out there in sports science. And as Pia said, take what you can from the report, take from your previous experience, take from the experts around you, and then work with the coach to implement as many strategies as possible. There's like, I don't know, 20, 30 recovery strategies alone in the game today. So, you know, in some ways, I think people talk about it like it's a secret, but it's not a secret really anymore, right? We've seen the game evolve so much that the fittest teams usually rise to the top, the most athletic teams, the teams that can execute decisions and decision-making under pressure rise to the top. They're all connected, right? If you're mentally fatiguing, it's because of the physical fatigue. And if you can get yourself fitter for longer stretches, if you can get your team fitter for longer stretches in game, mental fatigue doesn't arrive as early. And so you're sharper. So I think there's really no secret anymore. The data's clear. The data from 2015 that's now being compared on a female thresholds and our ability to sprint at 23 kilometers per hour. We're not comparing it to the men's ability anymore, I think is good. It's clear that if you're able to execute this, preparations before tournaments turn out to be performances in tournaments. If you go back to what happens before a World Cup, so it's the national team, the federation or association putting money towards their women's team before, and not just 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months before the World Cup, but 2 or 3 years now. And then it also ties to the club level and the club environment, how many games they play, how competitive are the games in their country. Or are they exporting players to other countries is another strategy for some countries. So for as long as I can remember, some of the most fit, athletic, resourced, let's call it sports science resource teams, they rise. So, Pia has all her expertise in coaching and tactics and motivating players. And this is just a little bit more information for Brazil. I love the thing that she said in her intro. She has to respect their culture first, right? And then implement some of this more physical sports science-based information, and just bring the players and the team and the support staff and the federation along to support them with all those resources. You know, if I was coaching in a country that wasn't one of the top producing physiological countries on this report, one of the first things I would do is say, okay, what can we do? What's realistic? What resources do we have? And what fits our culture to improve our physiological dimension?
Yeah, I love what you said about the fact that it's no secret. And it's something that I love about this report as well. I mean, you can really see every single team, from the championship team right down to the lowest performing team in the competition, the different stats for every team across all those different areas. And you start to see very clearly through those statistics why, you know, the US team won. And what the factors were that went into that, you know, that winning run that they had. Pia.
And Sarai, I would say real quick, the report's intention isn't to rank the countries,
No.
right? It's to benchmark the standards so other countries can reach more.
Absolutely. And not only the teams that were competing at the World Cup. I mean, this is something that can really be utilized by all 211 of our FIFA member associations. And that's one of the things that I really love about this report.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw to you, Pia. Across all the positions on the field, we saw an increase of 29% in distance covered in Zone 5, in that sprint zone, during France 2019 compared to Canada in 2015. An example of that, or the most pronounced change, came from the wide midfielders, with an increase of 47.3%. Having this kind of information as a coach, how does this shape your preparations for the next tournament?
Well, first of all, the knowledge, who is running, why is running, because as Paul said, it's different one game to another depending on the tactical stuff. So it's so important that you have the ability to be able to run repeated sprints over and over again. And I think that's interesting because it's been talking about the wide plays quite a bit. I'm wondering what this data will do with the center backs. Because we talk about fitness now, we talk about repeated sprints. If you add technique, I think that's very interesting. In Brazil, for instance, where we have technical players, what could you do if the speed of play, you know, it's increasing tremendously, like April said, if you add good technique as well. So now you talk about wide plays up and down the flank. What if you have a center back just leaving the next step? Well, I'm thinking about 2023 now, because I'm so inspired of all this data and so on. Could you imagine center back, great endurance, and she is good on the ball, and she will the one who decide and make the final pass and find a combination. So if you have, somebody said about athletes as well. So if we have athletes on the pitch, we have so many things, coaches to vary your tactical stuff, and what kind of football do you want to play? I think it's amazing.
Don't give away too much of your tactics before the next edition, Pia. So I'm gonna ask for a couple of takeaway comments before we throw to the questions that are coming in from our audience. I see we've got a few coming in. So if you still have questions to ask, Twitter at FIFAWWC, send those in and we'll see if we can get them across. So Pia, I want to stick with you. Thinking about the emerging countries, what can they take away from this report when they review their development and national team programs?
First of all, we have the knowledge, and compared to the best teams, you start with that. And then you look around and see what could we do. And I think a key word here is competitive. because you will, if you take a specific player, what is your very best? Then you need a competitive environment. So you have to look around, how can you get a competitive environment? It's not only the club leagues, it's every single practice. Well, myself, we've been playing against boys, but doing something and be very, very thorough, careful. How could you make it competitive? I think that is the key word.
Yeah, speaking about competitiveness, Dawn, considering these trends and the growth of the game, what do teams need to focus on for the next Women's World Cup cycle to maintain and build competitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. I think we've all acknowledged kind of on this kind of call and discussion already that there's much research warranted, because pretty much like we've spoken about kind of the physical match demands, but probably every facet of the preparation of female players right now, we base it off research on male cohorts. And again, I think we all agree women are not men. So I think, you know, kind of the research, first and foremost, to then inform us, you know, if we know the demands, we can then look at kind of the training needed, how females react to training and that side of it, the nutrition, you know, energy intake needs for players and so on. So for me, I think research first and foremost to inform us of what players need or what is appropriate for female players. And then I think, like, again, touching on what Pia said, it's how can we best inform clubs? How can we best inform national teams, well-supported countries, less supported countries, educate players, coaches, practitioners working in the female game, kind of support and promote around some of the educational areas that we find. And I think ultimately what we need is a cohesive support around the player to then best inform how they need to be prepared for what they're going to face in match play. So I think it's doing the research initially, the education, inform, support the practitioners, the players, the coaches, and then ultimately help to develop this kind of scientific support around players. For me, that's where you're going to get this continued growth in our players over the next few years. Like, we're already a year past the World Cup. So again, what do demands look like now? And I think excitedly, what do they look like in 3 years' time at the next World Cup as well?
Yeah, I totally agree with you there, Dawn. And it's something that we at FIFA will be putting a lot of effort into in terms of that education piece that you spoke about. You know, we're in a unique position with our 211 member associations to have a real impact at the elite level of the game with the use of this research. And it's something that we certainly will be prioritizing over the coming Women's World Cup cycle.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to have a look at the questions that we've got coming in. So the first one is coming in from the media, actually, from the Guardian newspaper. It's a question from Susan Rack. Hi, Susie. I hope you're well. So Susie says, the report says that there has been an increase in the running and efforts in Zone 5 from the group stage to the knockout rounds, implying that the higher ranked teams that progressed have an ability to maintain a physical intensity that the lower ranked teams can't. How do we make sure that by the next World Cup we see further progress across the board, but also ensure that the lower ranked teams are supported and able to bridge the physical gap with the US and the European sides that dominated in the business end of the tournament? Very, very good question from Susie. I want to throw this to you, first of all, Pia, from a coach perspective, if you could answer that for us, and then maybe Dawn, if you want to add on from a more physical perspective.
Well, as I said previously, it's about to make it competitive in your environment. And it's like Dawn said, is education. So you need international eyes, and you need help to get those international eyes. Very often you with your club and you think this is good, but there's always a next level. Mm-hmm. And just read the report. You can start with that and then see what could we do. Because if you want to be the best club team in your country. If you want to be the best country, you know, around the world, you just have to look and be humble to look at others. And again, be competitive education. And I think fitness coaches in general, who knows the game, I think that's important. Like Dawn, for instance, they could help to improve the game tremendously.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dawn, go ahead.
Sorry. I obviously agree with that. I think, you know, I think as well, like this report now for me is a great resource. You know, that teams, nations can pick up and see what teams at the greatest kind of tournament, like the greatest stage of women's football, like what teams are doing. I think the other piece is also recognizing what are the demands of your environment, like what is your coach philosophy, tactical kind of strategy, and then what are the physical outputs, demands based on that as well. But then I think the other piece, you know, like Pia said, is if you know what the end game is, like how do you now periodize or like what is your path to get there if you know those high physical outputs are kind of what you're kind of working towards. So then that is everything else around the team, and again that kind of cohesive integrated support to check off every single area of players' kind of performance, you know, the medical, the nutrition, the hydration, the recovery, as well as the technical, tactical, you know, kind of the physical input, the psychological. So again, I think it's part of the report is the resource. It's fact at what it is. What is your environment? Where are you now? You know, what are your physical capability? What's your profile of your players currently? Where do they sit? You know, could they tolerate those match loads currently? If not, how do you get there? You know, kind of reading resources out there, some of the literature, some of the science. And then I think, you know, from your perspective, FIFA perspective, how can that education be bridged to better inform the practitioners working in the female game?
Yeah, it really is a holistic approach that's needed. The whole kind of ecosystem that surrounds the team and the athletes has got to be addressed for sure.
Yep.
Okay, I have a couple of questions coming in from Marcus Ward, who is the sports scientist at Nottingham Forest Women's FC. Hello, Marcus. He's got two questions, one for April and one for Paul. So the first one to you, April, how do the panelists, how do you, April, think that the game will develop in the future to the next World Cup?
Well, I absolutely believe the execution of decision making is only going to increase more and more. Women are becoming more confident, more technical. They're more decisive when they play. I mean, the split second in tight spaces and the decisions in which players are making to one touch or two touch. We saw in this World Cup that the number of touches taken by each player went up a little bit, but the time on the ball went down a little bit. So the execution of the decisions and the speed of play is going to continue to accelerate. All of the people paying attention to Dawn and Paul and all the people out there doing their good work in the physical aspect of the game are adding to the foundation for women to be become more and more professionalized. So I think that's going to happen. And then going back to one of the things we talked about in the last summer, that were the center backs becoming playmakers, kind of to what Pia said earlier. Are center backs becoming playmakers? And, you know, I almost had center backs on my previous answer, but then I thought this is about a physical report. But when you think about the dribble penetration, the spin outs, the support, the confidence on the ball to play long, to play short, to split lines, to split defenses and bypass entire lines, and their execution on the ball. And of course, we never highlighted it in the technical study group, but the prowess in the air was unbelievable as well in this World Cup by the goalkeepers and the center backs. So I see those two things, and everything about transition and going faster and faster and the execution faster.
Yeah, yeah. I remember actually you touched on that at the technical conference in Milan, April, about the play really starting from the central back. So, and as a defender, a former defender, I totally agree with you. That's something that I saw unfolding in France as well. So the second question from Marcus, Paul, I'm going to give this one to you. Are there certain physical attributes or metrics that you think will progress more over the next few years than others?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. If we look at the stats for certain metrics from a positional point of view, across the positions we had like total distance covered, which increased by about 1 to 3%. Not a very sensitive measure. There's a lot of walking and jogging that make up that total distance covered. But the high intensity metrics are much more sensitive, and they'll change more rapidly over time. As people have mentioned, it's 15 to 30% approximately across the position. So it's going to be the high intensity metrics that change. But I think the point I want to make, it's not so much what distance a player covers at high intensity, but more so why they cover that distance. For example, we may have a fullback who covers 300 meters in, for example, zone 5. But it's important to understand what that distance is made up of. You know, is it overlapping, underlapping? Is it dribbling the ball at high intensity? Is it recovery runs? Is it pressing? Is it covering space? So it's not just about the metrics and the distances. It's linking that in with the tactical context and understanding it's not just what distance a player covers, but more so why they cover that distance. I think one of the things that myself and Dawn couldn't quantify that we probably wish we could quantify is the acceleration and decelerations. So we know that they're very common, that ability to accelerate and then to brake and decelerate is much more common than we see in terms of the high intensity running and sprinting. So I think in future it would be great if we could quantify the kind of inertial type of metrics like accelerations and decelerations, because I do think they would be even more sensitive.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, I think I'm being told here that I'd love to keep talking, but I'm being told that we only have time for one more question. And this question is coming in from Jeff Kassouf from The Equalizer. Now, Jeff, actually, I know Jeff was a co-author of a book that was released before the Women's World Cup, The Making of the Women's World Cup. A very good book. If you have a chance to read that, do go and read that. Jeff is asking, how much more do you think players are studying this science and buying into the data? At least for the teams you can speak to, and he's put in brackets Brazil and Sweden, do you feel like players rely on this data more now than even a few years ago? So I'm going to give this to our two coaches, actually, maybe starting with you, April, and then finishing with Pia.
Yeah, so this is an easy question for us. Women want to know why. If we can explain the why, they'll buy into almost everything. Hey, drink this really nasty green looking shake 2,000 times. They'll do it. If Don tells them why and explains the science, they're in. And I think certainly that's been my experience traveling around the world. When you work with women on the science, the evidence, the why, they're all in. It's the beauty of coaching women and being involved in the women's game is we are all in. When we understand why, how, and how this is going to help me, boom, we're in.
Pia, can you add to that?
Well, I agree with everything April said. I could just add, it doesn't matter if you come from China, from US, from Sweden, or from Brazil. If you present it and they ask why and you give them a good answer, this is a great coaching tool, actually, the data, not only the analyze, because I think there's a little bit difference between to analyze and coaching. And with this report, that will be great coaching for us in Brazil. That's for sure.
I'm looking forward to seeing some magic on the pitch from Brazil in 2023. I can't wait. So that's all we have time for, actually. We're almost at 1 hour. So I want to close off this online panel by thanking you all, our panelists. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating discussion for me, and I hope also for our audience. I want to give a special shout out to you, Dawn and Paul, as the authors of our report. Incredible job. And a reminder to all of those that are watching, you can download this. There's a link to this report on FIFA.com, especially for those practitioners out there, the coaches, the technical experts, the high performance experts. This is an incredible tool for you. So thank you a lot to Dawn and Paul for the incredible work that you contributed towards this report. And I want to give a really quick little shout out also to some of the people behind the scenes, especially to Patricia Gonzalez from my team and also Belinda Wilson. A lot of man hours went into this report, hours and hours and hours, and it's been a huge undertaking. So we certainly will be celebrating a little bit this evening now the report has been launched and we've had this incredible webinar. So thank you also to Patricia and to Belinda for all the work that you guys have done. And thank you for all those that have tuned in. So thank you very much, guys. I don't know if there's any final words from any of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck to everyone.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody.